Okay, so I'm going to be doing the design lecture for today. This is week 2, and because we didn't have a design lecture last week, we'll be doing this lecture in 2 parts. The first part will cover some intro to design, what design is, and how you can apply it to a website context. And then part 2 will cover visual hierarchy and some basic fundamentals of actual design. So yeah, let's get started. So let's start with part 1, which is Intro to Design. And because this is obviously a web design course, we want to be able to learn how to design our beautiful websites. So in order to do that, let's discuss what design is. So to first start off, I think I want to break down this common myth, which is that design is not purely just aesthetics. A lot of people tend to associate design with this idea of like art and perfection and like what you just see on the surface level, or design just being about the aesthetics. But design is much more than that. There's a lot that goes into designing interfaces and solving problems that constitute a lot of design thinking. And ultimately, it's all about how to break down those problems and solve it for whoever users will be using your apps, using your products, whether it's a digital context or a physical context. So we like to break it down kind of with this model where we start from bottom up. The first being like the strategy that goes into designing, which includes the business objectives, the user's needs, and this is where we like to start off in terms of our thinking. So when we think about design, when we want to get to the final product, the first thing you want to think about is who are the users we're serving and what is the overarching business or organizational objective that we want to reach. So whether you're working for yourself or you're working for a company or you're just designing something for your dad or your friend, we want to think about who those people are at the very bottom layer of um, the design objective. The next tier is scope. So once we figured out who the users are and who the organizational stakeholders are, what content is required and what features are required. So this is kind of where we start to brainstorm ideas. And let's say, I want to design a website for my dad. What content requirements will consist on this website? Maybe it's a picture of my dad. Maybe it's like a photo album of all of our cool memories together. And then what are the features that are required in this website? Maybe it's like a gallery of my dad's and I's pictures, or it's like a nav bar where it can toggle between some of his favorite foods or like favorite recipes. These are just like random ideas that I'm throwing out there, but that's kind of what scope consists of. So the specific things that go into who you're designing for. The next layer up is structure, which consists of information architecture and UX design. So I know that's like a couple of very loaded words, but when we think about information architecture, it's kind of talking about how we break down those features that I just mentioned. So how does it look like in the infrastructure of the app? So where are things organized? Where are things placed? It's kind of like redesigning your home in a way, like the real estate of the app. What's the architecture of where these features are placed and what the content is placed on? And UX design, which is like a very commonly thrown around word, is the experience of this all. So where do all these things lie and how does that affect the user? So you can kind of see how this is all tying together. How is X feature going to solve X pain point for this user? And that's exactly what user experience design is. The next layer up is skeleton, which consists of, like I mentioned, real estate design, as well as figuring out how it all connects. So once I figured out where things are placed, how do I navigate between those pages? So we're really getting into that like bare bones structure of the app. Like, how in a lot of phone interfaces, you've got like the tab at the bottom. That helps you navigate the things throughout the app, for example, and really helps you organize and break down what's intuitive for the user. And then finally, we have the surface, which is what a lot of people think design is all about, the visual design. And that's kind of where we get into like things like graphics and colors and typography and all the things that make the app look beautiful at the end of the day, and ultimately make design seem very effortless in all these different like layers and um, layers and components that go into it. So that's how we like to break it down in terms of like typical interface or product design thinking, and should be what you are thinking about in all of your projects. So yeah, this is kind of just like a very sporadic wording of how a lot of things in design are like thrown around. So design can really constitute in any form and any shape. So because it's such a broad field and it can exist everywhere, there are many different types of designs that we can think about, such as user interface design, which is kind of what I've been using to backbone all these examples, as well as graphic design, which is more visual, service design, which is in a more like theoretical context. There's all these things that that design can be applied into, and that can really shape into whatever discipline that you are interested in. So whether it's websites, whether it's like your interior or like a service that you want to design, the previous slide illustrates how we can break that down and design the best experience overall. In this class, we'll be focusing on user interface design, user experience design, and human-centered design, most specifically, because that's what the main parts of design that are applicable to websites. So let's get into user interface, which is the space in which interactions between humans and machines occur. So when we think about a phone, so here's my phone, the interface is what I'm touching and it directly interacting with. So that's what the UI kind of consists of. So if I'm on the Facebook app, that's the interface that I will be interacting with. User experience design, however, is more so related to the person's emotions and attitudes about using a product or a system or a service. And this is commonly thrown around with UI UX just because they can't exist without each other. But user experience goes into more of those like nitty-gritty feelings that a product might make you feel. So let's say I have a really complex app that I can't seem to navigate. That might give me a really frustrating UX. But if it's a really intuitive UX, like I'm going to give an example of like Spotify, for example, I might feel happy using it. You know, it's a positive user experience. So that's kind of what we're saying when we talk about UX. And finally, we have human-centered design, which is an approach that incorporates the human perspective, i.e. what works best for humans. This process will be covered later on, but essentially this process is how we like to center our design process in, and the steps that we like to take to optimize the UI and the UX that I just mentioned. Basically, if we all sum it down, form meets function. So form is how the design will actually look, and function is how we design those elements to piece together and work seamlessly. I just can't see it. So a lot of people like to throw out this excuse when they approach design where, you know, they don't know how to design things, they don't know how to make things look good. How come my designs don't look like other people's examples? But in reality, anyone can design. It all comes down to, you know, fidelity and functionality and really being able to break down those problems. Not everyone is as artistic as, you know, like someone who's been taking art classes for years, but you know, if you're taking this class, we're trying to equip you with the problem-solving skills it takes to design something that's usable. And it's definitely something that you can learn and get really good at. So let's break it down into the simplest form, which is a low/mid fidelity mock. If you're looking at the screen right now, you're seeing like very simple lines everywhere. And this is kind of like the first step we take to designing something really complex or beautiful. Let me get into this a little bit more. And I'll get into that a little bit more later. But when we take that, we often convert it into high fidelity at the very end of the cycle, where this is actually the screen that you'll be seeing at the end of your website. So you can kind of see how they compare the low fidelity and high fidelity. The low fidelity is a much simpler, much more stripped down version of something that will eventually be built out or eventually be designed in all of their fancy colors and forms and such. So when you're, figuring out what design to do, always start out with the most simplest version, which is a low fidelity, and then work your way up. And then we also have interactive prototypes, which are when the design actually comes to its fullest form with animations, things that make you feel like you're actually interacting with something that responds in the way that you think it will respond. So if I'm swiping right, my carousel might swipe right. If I'm clicking something, it might give me a little animation saying that like I'm successful in doing something. So this is like taking it to the next level in terms of like adding those things that'll give you the user feedback you need to interact with the app in the best way possible. And when we put it all together, from the low fidelity to the high fidelity to the actual code, we can kind of put it in this perspective where we first have the wireframe, which is what I mentioned in the low fidelity screen, where it's just a bunch of lines, boxes to place hold things, and then you turn it into like the high fidelity, which is the website box in this case, where you actually put in the pictures, you put in the text, you put in the fonts and the colors, and then we can code that up. And that's where Stephen covers in the programming lectures, where you take the design and you actually build it out. And yeah, I just went through this. Essentially, yeah, like you can see how the box corresponds to the high fidelity version. This green box over here is empty, but now it's filled. These smaller boxes hold the text. So, it says discover and eat French cheese, the cheesemonger. We can do that in its simplest form in a wireframe to make it the quickest and simplest visualization of what we're building. And then once we're ready and once we're happy with it, we can convert it into a high fidelity version. And yeah, so I know we mentioned this in the first lecture, the creative tools necessary to build a website. Let me go back. Essentially, when we're thinking about design, we're focusing on this green block here, which is prototyping. And the four main creative tools that we want to use when thinking about design and prototyping out designs necessary for code, we're looking at things like Figma, Adobe XD, Sketch, and Illustrator. Okay, here's some encouragement interlude. We all need it sometimes, and I think design is something that a lot of people want to be able to do, but they just don't know how to approach it. And also, I feel like there are a lot of people out there who discount their ability to do design a lot of the times because it seems like something that only people with like the design eye can do, which is like complete nonsense. I feel like, if you really take a step back at it and strip design down to its core, good design is definitely not always about the visuals. It can look really good, but it might not work. And in order to be a really good designer, you got to figure out how all those things work, how the human perspective plays into things, and that's when your code can really become something meaningful. So yeah, if you're interested in design, here are the breakdowns of what we'll be doing over the next few weeks. The first being fundamentals, and then user interface, and then exploration. Since it's on Zoom, we're not going to do questions, but let's get into part 2, which is visual hierarchy through spacing. So we'll cover the importance of space as well as macro and micro level spacing. So we've covered what design is, and now we're going to break it down a little bit into some visual considerations that'll help you really understand what good practice UI is, and as well as like just how to lay things out in a way that is clear to a user and makes things easier for them to comprehend when they're navigating something like a website or a product. So first off, the importance of space. Let's get into some examples. So what is wrong with these user interfaces? The first one is here. I'm just gonna like pause a little bit, I guess, for you to think about it. But it's not looking too hot here. Essentially, this website has a complete and utter lack of space. All the words are bunched together, all the pictures are bunched together. It's hard to figure out what text corresponds to what image and really just what all these boxes mean. So you can kind of see here in a very extreme example how space is so valued in a lot of interfaces and maybe how you might be taking it for granted a lot in really good design apps. Because here, like, if I'm trying to look for a product to buy, how am I really going to parse through it with my own eyes? Here's another example. This is like a video game, which I guess is a different context for things, but if things get really hard to view, how are you supposed to play the game in the most optimal way possible? There's everything is going on at the same time. There's like boxes everywhere. Your actual character is like hidden behind all these like pop-ups. So this is another example of how space is very valued and something that's like literally happening in real time. So to break it all down, the UI is cluttered. And what's wrong with cluttering at the end of the day? Essentially, users won't see that much content. You're covering everything, you're squishing everything together. Like I mentioned, even though there might be a lot of content, the user might not be able to see it at the first glance. And that's problem number one. When we look at an app, we want to see what's on it. We want to be able to grasp the essence of what I'm looking at the quickest moment. And, you're always trying to optimize for that. The second is the loss of visual hierarchy is overwhelming. So when we think of apps that have headers and images to break up the visual hierarchy of things, it's really easy. It makes it a lot easier to kind of parse through and scroll through what you're looking at. In the previous examples, there is no sense of hierarchy. There's no like header that I'm first drawn to. It's just a lot of just like mush everywhere. So that can get really overwhelming for a user. And the last is quality over quantity. So like I mentioned, it kind of brings it all down to, if we want to show a lot of content, how do we do that without losing the quality of what I'm showing to the users? So the previous examples, it kind of put it down to like squeezing everything into one space that is not big enough for all of them to coexist. So that's why we have things like scroll, that's why we hide certain elements, and that's why it's so important at the end of the day to really figure out what is the most important thing to show at the appropriate times. And that's a lot of compromise, but it's what we learn in design to optimize our experience for the users. User attention at the end of the day is a very precious resource and should be allocated accordingly, because if we don't have a user's attention, how are we going to keep them using the app, and how is the app going to help them at the end of the day solve their user needs? Using space intentionally establishes that hierarchy of information, and it makes it a lot easier for them to read things as fast as they can, grasp the main point of what the screen is, and ultimately navigate the app a lot better and more intuitively than they would have if it's completely cluttered and overwhelming. So here's a little terminology. When we think about space, we have two types of space, positive and negative space. The positive space is typically filled up by content, things like images, text, the main kind of meat of the page, if you will. And then we have negative space, which is white space or just empty space. It doesn't have to be necessarily white. White is just like a term we like to throw out there. If the background's black, it can be black space, I guess. But essentially, it's negative empty space that exists between the positive elements. So let's say I have like two images stacked on each other. The space in between is white space. And it essentially is essential to this idea of space because it defines content in that positive space. If we don't have any negative space, then we also don't have any positive space because they can't coexist without each other. And that space creates emphasis on certain things that we may want the user's eye to catch to. So here's an example of how spacing is used in a physical context. Maybe this will help you visualize the idea of space a little bit better in something that's not necessarily like as abstract as a digital form. So you can clearly see how there's rows down the middles of these aisles that divide up the space where people are walking through. If I just had a bunch of tables squished together, people won't be able to walk through and breathe and really just like see these laptops and beautiful technologies on these tables, right? Same thing with a UI. If I just squish everything together, I'm not going to be able to see anything that's important on the page. I'm not going to be able to see the text or the images, anything. Here's the example of how Google uses it. It really draws your attention to this main search engine that Google is mainly, it's all like the search engine is the primary feature of Google. So all the space around it is defining the positive space, which is this header and the search bar right here. And immediately my eye is caught to that to direct me into using this search engine. So as you can see, this negative space is what we'd refer to as a white space around this main element. And the positive space is what the main functionality usually coexists in, and the main thing that we ultimately want our users to interact with. To all sum it up, and if I were to give you one lesson from this lecture, more white space equals more emphasis. So, immediately you catch if you even looking at the slide, immediately you catch your eye to the left side, which is more white space, more emphasis. And you look less at the right side, which just has all the same words all clumped together, and your eye focuses on it way less, which is the main point of this. Here's another example where we have paragraphs. The left side has less line spacing, so it's harder to parse through, while the right side has a thicker line spacing, which makes it easier for the eye to go left and right and up and down. Now let's get into macro and micro level spacing. So let's do some definitions. Macro level spacing is essentially the space between core elements of the page. It essentially creates structure and that breathing room that we talked about when we brought up the Apple example. The next is micro level spacing, which is on a smaller scale, but is working to increase legibility and understanding of text and information. We'll do that in a little bit in a few lectures. Here's an example of the white space used really well, where we have the main screen of Stripe that introduces this visual hierarchy of what their app is all about, which is payments infrastructure for the internet. And we have all this white space around that catches your eye to the image as well as the large header. And that's kind of an example of macro level spacing, which divides up the core blocks of the page, if you will. So the block of text, the block of image, and then the rest of the logos below. Here's like a breakdown of it. So if we look at this box right here, this might be a box that you might end up coding up in your websites. But essentially, the page sections use background colors and white space to create that separation. So we have this block with the text in it, as well as the nav bar at the top. Individual sections of the page use compositional spacing on a more micro scale. So as the previous example explained, we have the larger text breaking up the entire span of the website. In this case, we can break it down even further, where we have spacing between smaller text, spacing between buttons, and this gives it that greater hierarchical parsability, because we're able to kind of see the whole composition of how the website builder wanted this and intended this to be seen by the user. Here's a breakdown of what padding and margins are. So on the left, we see padding, which is the spacing between and within the border of an element. So when we think about padding, let's say we have a button, for example. The padding is what's inside the button. It's what's giving the submit text some breathing room. When you think about margin, it's the spacing between elements. So let's say I have a bunch of buttons stacked up on top of each other. The margin is what defines that spacing between things. So this is an example of kind of like the micro level spacing that I just talked about, where these are some little things to take into mind when we think about adding white space and space into our designs. In CSS, to bring it back to coding and tie up all these like design spiels that I'm just talking about, spacing in CSS involves the box model. And this is kind of like what you should keep in mind in your mental model for web design. When we think about this blue box right here, this is our element. Padding is what extends out to the borders. So this yellow area is the borders. It's what essentially defines the space from the inside element to the border. And then margin is kind of like the outermost layer. So it's the imaginary kind of box that differentiates this element from other elements that might be next to it. Let's get into line width, which is essentially another type of micro spacing that you may have seen in previous slides, where it essentially defines the spacing between paragraphs to make things easier to read. And as a rule of thumb, narrow paragraphs typically mean it's easier to read. It involves less scanning for the eyes. And we usually like to use a div to reduce and restrict the width of a text. So let's look at this. This is medium. You might notice that on a lot of news websites and just newspaper readers in general, typically condense the width of text when you're reading. This is to allow for your eyes to have less horizontal width to have to scan through. And when you condense it, you have to go back and forth less. There are less words you have to read horizontally, and having more line height gives you that breathing room for your eyes to go up and down. So it's a very good compromise of like making sure your eyes don't get too strained, making sure that you have one thing to focus on. Here's kind of like a comparison of different line widths. So in the first example, we have width of 100. You can kind of see how it gets really hard to like read back and forth. My eyes are already kind of getting strained. Versus an example where we condense a little bit, where the width is 960 pixels. Immediately, we can kind of see better parsability here, where I'm having to go back and forth with my head less, and I'm able to kind of focus on one area and not have to move back and forth. In terms of some metrics, we typically like to say that margins and paddings around an element should be consistent and equal. So typically in design industry, we do it by rules of 4. So using multiples of 4 in paddings and margins is a good rule of thumb. So if you have a button, maybe you have like 8 pixels of padding. Keep that consistent throughout your designs, and use simple multiples for most of the margins and paddings that you'll be implementing. It sounds very nitty-gritty, but it does make a difference when you're thinking about large scale of things. Another thing to note is that simple is not the same as barren. Barren is the often overuse of spacing, and a little bit too much of this can break the relationship between elements. We can kind of see here where there's just like a lot of space everywhere, where although there's like a lot of space everywhere, it can be hard to kind of see what's going on. There's like a lot less hierarchy here than a lot of websites that use space really effectively. And here's like a zoom up of this. Although there's like space on the sides, space like on the top, it can kind of seem very barren in the sense that we don't have things breaking up the page. There aren't images to kind of show that hierarchy a little bit better. And overall, it just seems really like empty and hard to look at and focus. Here's a better use of white space where we have better structuring of that macro and micro compositional scale that we talked about before. To sum it all up, try to avoid the barren. Make your spacing intentional through rhythm, asymmetry, and/or gestalt principles. And creating that rhythmic structure often relies on those patterns for content. Space and content structures are used to define this rhythmic pattern and allow you to kind of give your website that really organizational and readable flow. Symmetry and asymmetry are often used in this spacing example as well. Symmetry creates that balance with repeating patterns and rhythmic structure, and a vast majority of macro layouts of sites are also symmetric. For example, on Instagram, a lot of things are center aligned. You got the image grid, which is obviously symmetrical, and you also have a lot of like rules of thirds, where there's grids everywhere that keep everything very middle aligned and really equal. Asymmetry often uses asymmetric designs to create emphasis. So maybe you have a larger thumbnail on one side that you want to catch their eye to. And that kind of size relational asymmetry creates another type of hierarchy. So in this case, we have the Adobe logo really big, and that picture essentially is the main element on the page. In previous examples, we see like a phone image on a website being the main thing that distinguishes itself from everything else on the page. Okay, so I think that brings us to the last of, or the end of this lecture. Some things to note, we'll post cheat sheets for general topics in this class. I think because this was a little bit long, we'll post a cheat sheet on Ed, not Piazza, about the general topic covered. If you're interested in a specific design topic, Medium is a great place to start. There's a lot of more advanced topics and more challenging things to learn there. Another thing is have a Figma account or have it downloaded by next week. That's super important. I think the date is a little bit outdated. Sorry about that. It should be next Thursday, not this Thursday. We'll make a post about it just for a reminder. Another reminder to fill out the feedback form. So I think most TAs will be releasing this next week, just for us to allow you to voice whatever concerns you need to best support yourself in this class. And yeah, that brings us to the end. So yeah, let me know if you have any questions, but this wraps up the design portion for this week.